And if you stay with this long enough, something else starts to become visible beneath all of it. You begin to notice that what used to feel like emotional urgency is slowly losing its grip. Not because you are forcing it away, and not because you have suddenly figured everything out, but because your internal system is no longer reacting in the same automatic way it once did. There was a time when certain thoughts could pull you into entire emotional spirals. A memory would surface, and suddenly it would feel like you were inside it again. A person would come to mind, and your entire inner state would shift without permission. A possibility, a fear, a question. Each one had the power to reorganize your mood within seconds. But something in that pattern has started to loosen, not disappear, not vanish overnight, just loosen. And that loosening is not always comfortable at first, because the mind often interprets emotional stability as emptiness when it is used to intensity. It confuses quiet with lack. It confuses stillness with absence. It confuses reduced reactivity with loss of feeling. But what is actually happening is not loss. It is regulation. It is your system learning, slowly, that not everything deserves the same level of internal response it used to receive. And that is a deeper shift than it appears on the surface. Because when your emotional world stops treating every thought as an emergency, something important begins to return to you. Space. Space to notice what is actually present, rather than what is being triggered. Space to observe your life instead of being constantly pulled into it. Space to respond instead of react. And in that space, something subtle begins to grow. A different kind of awareness, not loud, not dramatic, not constantly demanding your attention, but steady. And the strange part is, you may not immediately trust it because it does not match the emotional patterns you were once familiar with. You might even question it at times. You might wonder if something is missing, if something has gone quiet that should still be active. But not everything that goes quiet is gone. Some things are simply no longer running the same programs in the background. And that is where real change often hides, not in what you can clearly point to, but in what no longer pulls you without your consent. Over time, you also start to realize something else. You are not the same person who first began carrying certain emotional weight. Even if your external life looks similar, even if your routines are familiar, even if your responsibilities have not changed, the internal interpretation of those experiences has shifted. Things that once felt like rejection do not land in the same way anymore. Things that once felt like confusion begin to feel more neutral. Things that once felt deeply personal start to reveal themselves as patterns that were never fully about you in the way you assumed. And this is not about becoming indifferent. It is about becoming clearer. Clearer in how you see people. Clearer in how you see yourself. Clearer in how you assign meaning to what happens around you. Because a large part of emotional suffering does not come from events themselves, but from the meanings we attach to them before we even realize we are doing it. And when those meanings begin to loosen, your entire inner landscape changes. You begin to experience moments where you do not immediately assign a story to what you feel. A pause appears between experience and interpretation. And in that pause, something new becomes possible. You do not have to immediately become the old version of yourself in response to what you feel. You can simply observe it. Let it exist without turning it into identity. And at first, that can feel unfamiliar, even slightly disorienting, because the mind prefers certainty, even if that certainty is painful. It prefers known patterns over unknown space. But growth often requires a period where you are no longer fully governed by the old patterns, while the new ones are still forming their strength. That is why this stage can feel like being suspended between two internal worlds, one that you recognize, even if it no longer serves you in the same way, and one that feels more aligned but still unfamiliar in its silence. So you move carefully through your days, sometimes without realizing how much is actually changing underneath your surface functioning. You still show up, you still engage, you still manage what needs to be managed, but internally, you are no longer reinforcing every emotional loop you once did, and that alone begins to shift everything. Because what you consistently stop feeding slowly begins to weaken, not through effort, but through disuse. And what you begin to nourish instead, even in small ways, calm responses, slower interpretations, moments of self-awareness, starts to grow in strength without needing to announce itself. This is why transformation is often misunderstood while it is happening. It does not always feel like becoming better. It often feels like becoming unfamiliar. But unfamiliar is not the same as wrong. It is simply what happens when identity is no longer fixed in the same place it used to be. And in that unfolding, you may also notice something else. The way you relate to your own thoughts begins to change. You are not inside them as completely as before. You are slightly beside them, watching them arise, watching them pass, watching them lose intensity without needing to fight them directly. And this distance is not disconnection, it is perspective, a kind of internal breathing room that allows you to exist without being fully absorbed by every mental movement. From this place, even your past begins to reorganize itself, not as something that defines you, but as something that contributed to your formation. Certain memories lose their emotional charge, others lose their authority over your present choices, and some remain, but no longer feel like they are asking you to become someone again who you have already outgrown. And slowly, without forcing it, you begin to recognize a different relationship with yourself. Less reaction, more observation, less entanglement, more presence, less internal noise, more clarity in moments where clarity used to feel impossible, and perhaps most importantly, a growing recognition that you do not need to resolve everything immediately in order to be okay within yourself. There is a kind of stability that does not come from answers. It comes from learning to remain present even while answers are still forming. And that is what this stage is quietly teaching you, even if you do not consciously frame it that way yet. You are learning how to exist without rushing your own becoming, how to let meaning unfold instead of forcing it into place, how to trust that what is shifting internally does not need to be fully understood in order to be real. And over time, something very subtle but very real begins to happen. You stop measuring your progress only by external outcomes or emotional intensity, and you start noticing internal alignment instead, how you respond, how quickly you return to yourself after being emotionally pulled, how often you choose awareness over automatic reaction, how much space exists between what happens and how deeply it defines you. And these are not small indicators. They are the quiet architecture of real change. Because long before life looks different on the outside, it first becomes different in the way it is experienced from within. And that is already happening here. Even if it is not loud, even if it is not fully clear yet, even if part of you still feels like you are in between versions of yourself, you are not outside of change. You are inside it. And it is already shaping the way you will eventually recognize yourself again. The waiting can feel like it's draining you in ways you didn't expect. Time moves forward, but your situation feels like it's suspended in place. Still, even in that space, you keep going. You keep showing up in your life. You keep making effort. You keep choosing not to return to what no longer aligns with who you are becoming, even when there is no visible reward for that choice yet. Carl Jung described something that helps make sense of this inner state. He called it the transcendent function. It is the psychological process where inner opposites begin to interact in a way that creates something entirely new. Not one side defeating the other, not one feeling erasing another, but a deeper integration forming from the tension itself. The part of you that wants to move forward and the part that is afraid to let go. The version of you shaped by the past and the version of you that is still unfolding. The grief of what has ended and the quiet pull toward what is next. These inner forces do not resolve by force or by choosing a winner. They resolve by holding each other long enough for something third to appear. Something unexpected, something that neither side could have produced alone. That is the essence of transformation through tension. But this process does not follow your timing. It doesn't wait for you to feel ready. It doesn't arrive when life becomes easier or clearer. It doesn't show up because you finally figured everything out. It begins when the old inner structure starts loosening enough that something new can take shape inside that space. And that loosening is where most people misunderstand what is happening to them. It often feels like nothing is moving forward. It can feel like confusion taking over, like certainty dissolving, like you're standing still while life continues without you. But what feels like stagnation is often the beginning of internal reorganization. What feels like emptiness is actually space being created. The pressure you are experiencing is not random, it is not meaningless, it is the sensation of an old version of your life breaking down while something new is forming underneath it. You are not stuck in place, you are in transition. You are in the middle stage where identity is no longer what it was, but not yet what it will become. And this is one of the hardest psychological positions to live in, because there is no clear reference point. You are no longer the person you used to be. Yet the new version has not fully stabilized. So you move through daily life from a space that feels uncertain, unanchored, and undefined. But that in-between space is not a mistake. It is not a delay. It is not proof that you are behind or that something is wrong. It is the actual work of transformation. It is the phase where inner systems reorganize in silence, while outwardly life may still look ordinary. From the outside, nothing appears unusual. You continue working, speaking, meeting responsibilities, responding to messages, showing up for others. You laugh when it is appropriate, you make plans, you function, but internally, something far more complex is happening beneath that surface stability. Old beliefs about yourself are being questioned. Ideas about love, worth, connection, and identity are shifting. Things you once accepted without question are no longer feeling true in the same way. Patterns you tolerated are being re-evaluated, and new questions are beginning to form where certainty used to exist. What am I no longer willing to accept? What did I carry only because I thought I had no choice? What parts of me have been waiting quietly for recognition and space? This internal restructuring is not visible, but it is real. And it is deeply significant. Now, there is also someone else who lives in your awareness, not as the center of your journey, but as part of its emotional landscape. The person who still appears in your thoughts without invitation, the one tied to certain memories that surface unexpectedly, triggered by something small, something ordinary. A sound, a phrase, a moment of light, and suddenly the past becomes present again. It is important to understand that they are not outside of this process either. They are moving through their own internal experience, even if it is not visible to you. There is a distance between who they have been and who they are being pushed to become by their own life experiences. That distance creates pressure, and that pressure cannot be resolved through distraction or avoidance. It eventually demands reflection. What they are confronting is not always obvious, even to them. It is the gap between their outer expression and their inner truth. And closing that gap requires honesty they may not yet fully know how to access, so it unfolds slowly, often indirectly, sometimes uncomfortably. And somewhere in that internal process, your presence remains part of their psychological landscape, not as something controlling their path, and not as something defining their choices, but as something that was real, something that left an imprint. The depth, the emotional presence, the authenticity you brought into their life did not simply disappear because circumstances changed. Those experiences do not vanish. They move deeper into the psyche, where they continue to exist in quieter ways. And sometimes what is placed there begins to resurface in reflection, in memory, in realization. But this is not about waiting. It is not about hoping someone else reaches a certain understanding before your life can continue. That is not the purpose of this awareness. What matters most is what is happening within you, the version of you that is forming right now, in this uncertain space, in the silence where progress is not always visible, is not incomplete. It is not paused, it is becoming. And that becoming is what shapes the kind of life and love that can actually meet you in truth, not in compromise or self-abandonment. Real connection does not require you to reduce yourself. It does not ask you to perform or shrink or constantly adjust to be accepted. It meets you where you are fully present in your own identity, without apology or distortion. And even if it does not feel like it yet, You are closer to that state than you realize. Often, transformation feels least active right before it becomes visible. It feels like waiting, like uncertainty, like silence. But internally, alignment is forming in ways that only become clear later. Carl Jung observed this pattern in psychological development. The most meaningful shifts rarely announce themselves in advance. They emerge after sustained tension, after periods that are often misinterpreted as nothing happening at all. But underneath that appearance, something is reorganizing, preparing, becoming ready to take form. They often come to believe that everything they have poured in has gone to waste, when in truth, what they are living through is the final intensity of transformation. The unseen work beneath the surface, the closing stage before something entirely new is ready to emerge. A cocoon never feels like progress while you are inside it. It does not feel beautiful or hopeful in the moment. It feels limiting. It feels heavy. It feels like being held in a space that no longer matches who you are. And yet, it is precisely in that enclosed space where change is quietly completing itself. Nothing about it looks like movement from the inside, but everything essential is rearranging in silence. What feels like stillness is often the deepest form of construction. Then, without warning, the structure begins to break. You are not failing. What you are feeling is the kind of pressure that often comes right before a shift in identity. That pressure is not random or meaningless. It has been accumulating with purpose, building in alignment with everything you have been moving through. Each difficult experience has been working on something within you. Every disappointment, every night of loneliness, every moment you chose to continue instead of giving up, every time you chose yourself when it was easier not to, all of it has been shaping something deeper than you can currently see. What makes this stage so confusing is that the outer world does not reflect the inner work. There are no visible signs that anything meaningful is happening, no confirmation that endurance has value, no immediate reward for persistence, only repetition, only silence, only the quiet expectation that you continue anyway. And in that continuation, something unseen begins to form, a steadiness that does not depend on outcome, a strength that does not collapse when recognition is absent. One day, your perspective on this entire chapter will change. You will look back with understanding that was not available to you while you were inside it. You will recognize what was being formed in the background of your life. You will see the hidden structure that was slowly taking shape beneath all the uncertainty. And what once felt like confusion will begin to look like design. What once felt like delay will reveal itself as preparation. But before that clarity arrives, there is something important to hold on to. Trust that nothing you have been doing in silence has been wasted. Trust that every morning you got up and kept going mattered. Trust that the choices you made when no one was watching carried weight. When there was no recognition, no applause, no external validation, only your private commitment to keep moving forward, those moments were not empty. They were foundational. They were building something steady within you, something that is almost ready to surface. And yet, during these periods, the mind often tries to rewrite the story. It begins to measure progress through immediate outcomes. It starts to question what cannot yet be seen. It compares present stillness with imagined timelines that were never real to begin with. But transformation does not follow urgency. It follows depth. It follows internal readiness, not external expectation. What is being shaped within you cannot be rushed into visibility before it has fully formed. There is another layer to this story that involves the person who still occupies space in your thoughts. It is important to speak about this carefully because it is easy to misunderstand. They are also being shaped by your absence, not in loud or obvious ways, not in dramatic confessions or visible change, but in the quiet interior space where real transformation actually happens. The version of you they remember is not static. It continues to live within their memory, and in subtle ways, it interacts with who they are becoming now. It brings questions with it, not spoken questions, not always conscious ones, but internal pressure points that begin to form over time. Who am I becoming now? Am I living in alignment with what I actually feel? Or am I still repeating patterns that once felt safe, but no longer feel true? What did I overlook when I assumed things would remain the same? These questions do not arrive all at once. They surface slowly, often in moments of stillness, when distraction no longer fills the space the way it used to. They appear in pauses, in memory, in unexpected emotional echoes. And even if they are not fully acknowledged, they begin to shape perception from within. But it is essential to understand something clearly here. This is not about you waiting. It is not about your life being placed on hold. It is not about your healing depending on someone else's internal process. That is not the purpose of this awareness. The purpose is to bring you back to yourself. Because your becoming cannot be structured around someone else's timing. Your growth cannot remain paused in anticipation of another person's realization. The life that is forming within you right now requires your full presence, not your divided attention. When attention is split between what is and what might return, you lose contact with the only place real change can happen, here. You are not a supporting character in someone else's unfolding story. You are the central presence in your own. And as you begin to step more fully into that role, something important starts to happen. You do not become less available to love. You become available in the right way. You become clearer, more grounded, more anchored in who you are without needing external permission to exist as yourself. You stop negotiating your presence. You stop shrinking to maintain connection. You stop overextending to prove value that was never in question. You are not becoming harder to reach. You are becoming more real. And realness is what true connection recognizes, not performance, not self-abandonment, not shrinking to fit into spaces that were never designed for your fullness. Real connection meets you where you are whole, not where you are diminished. It responds to presence that is steady, not anxious. It aligns with people who are no longer abandoning themselves in order to be chosen. Even if it does not feel like it yet, especially in the middle of uncertainty, something in you is aligning. These quiet phases often precede the most visible shifts. From the inside, it feels like waiting. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. But beneath that surface, something is reorganizing itself into a new structure. Old emotional patterns begin to lose their authority. Old definitions of love begin to dissolve. Old versions of identity begin to loosen their grip. Carl Jung observed this pattern in psychological development. Meaningful change rarely announces itself in advance. It builds under tension, often during periods that feel unproductive or unclear, until the internal system reaches a point where something new becomes possible. What cannot be integrated through comfort is often integrated through contrast. What cannot be understood quickly is understood deeply over time, and that is where you are now. Not at the end, not stuck, not forgotten, but in transition, in the final stages of becoming. And what is important to remember is that these final stages often feel the most uncertain because they are closest to completion. The structure is no longer invisible, but it is not yet fully formed. You can feel change approaching without being able to define it. You can sense direction without having arrived at clarity. You can experience inner movement while the outer world still appears unchanged. But something in you already knows how this ends. Not in the sense of prediction, but in the sense of recognition. The part of you that has persisted through everything already carries the imprint of what you are becoming. And that part does not doubt the process, even when the mind does. So you continue, not because everything is clear, but because something within you refuses to abandon what is still unfolding. And in that refusal, without noise or announcement, the transformation completes itself.